All right, let's dive into some pretty heavy stuff. You've asked for a breakdown of the problem of perception, specifically for a philosopher like yourself, and sent over some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the problem of perception.
Ah,
Don't worry, I've brought in an expert to help us untangle this philosophical knot.
Yeah, this is definitely a topic that really gets to the core of how we understand our relationship to the world. We're going to be looking at those fundamental assumptions about how we experience reality.
Definitely. Yeah, let's start with what the text calls the ordinary conception of perceptual experience. What we usually assume about how we see and interact with the world, it calls this direct realism, which basically says we perceive the world, directly. Like I look out my window and I see a tree, and there it is, just as it is, no funny business.
Mhm.
Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, the key concept here is direct presentation. The idea that our experience gives us immediate, unmediated access to the object itself. No middleman, no mental gymnastics, just pure, unadulterated perception.
But then the text throws a wrench in the works by bringing up illusions, like the classic example of a white wall appearing yellow under certain lighting conditions. If we're directly perceiving reality, why does our perception sometimes seem to clash with what's actually there?
Yeah, that's precisely the problem of perception in a nutshell. Illusions and even more so hallucinations force us to question whether our senses are always reliable guides to reality. If we can have experiences that don't correspond to the actual world, how can we ever be certain that we're truly perceiving things directly?
So wait, are you saying I can't even be sure this microphone I'm talking into actually exists?
Right.
What if I'm just hallucinating this whole podcast studio?
Well, that's where things get philosophically interesting. The text outlines two main arguments against direct realism, the argument from illusion and the argument from hallucination. These arguments aim to show that our senses can be tricked and that sometimes what we perceive might not be a faithful representation of reality.
Okay, let's unpack those arguments. The argument from illusion. I'm guessing that's where the yellow wall example comes in. We see yellow, but the wall is actually white, so what are we really seeing?
Exactly. The argument from illusion points out that if it seems like you're experiencing a certain quality like yellowness, something must possess that quality even if it isn't the object itself. So where does that yellowness reside?
So maybe there's some other thing we're perceiving directly, some intermediary between us and the object.
And that leads us to the argument from hallucination, which takes this idea a step further. Imagine having a vivid experience that feels just like seeing a snow-covered churchyard. But there is no churchyard, no snow, nothing there at all.
Hold on, how is that even possible? Isn't that like saying I could be having a conversation with a ghost right now?
It's more like a waking dream. Dreams can feel incredibly real while we're experiencing them, even though they don't correspond to anything in the external world.
Yeah.
Hallucinations in this philosophical sense are like that experiences that are indistinguishable from genuine perceptions, even though they aren't grounded in any real objects.
That's seriously mind-bending. So if we can have these hyper-realistic experiences without any corresponding reality, how can we ever be sure we're genuinely perceiving the world directly? It seems like direct realism is already starting to crumble.
You're catching on quickly. This very question is what has driven philosophers to develop numerous theories of experience, each attempting to solve this problem of perception in its own way. The text you've shared delves into several of these: sense datum theory, adverbialism, intentionalism, and naive realist disjunctivism.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack, but I'm ready to dive in. Let's start with the sense datum theory. What exactly are these sense data and how do they fit into the picture?
Sense datum theory suggests that what we directly perceive aren't physical objects themselves, but rather special mental entities called sense data. Think of it like this. When you look at a red apple, you're not directly perceiving the apple itself, but rather a mental representation of it, a kind of internal image or impression. This image is what we call a sense datum, and it's this sense datum, not the apple, that you're directly aware of.
Wait a minute, if we only ever experience these sense data, how can we be sure they accurately represent the real world? Couldn't our sense data be completely off base, like a distorted reflection in a funhouse mirror?
That's a great question and a common objection to sense datum theory. You're basically pointing out that this theory seems to trap us in our own minds, forever separated from the real world by a veil of sense data.
It's starting to sound like the brain in a vat scenario. How do we know we're not just brains floating in a vat fed artificial sensory information? It's starting to feel like we're venturing into the matrix here.
You're hitting on some classic philosophical thought experiments, and this is exactly the kind of challenge sense datum theorists have to address. One way they try to bridge the gap between sense data and the real world is by arguing that even though we directly perceive sense data, these sense data are caused by and correspond to real objects in the world. They act as intermediaries representing those objects in our minds.
So it's like we're watching a movie of the real world projected onto the screen of our consciousness. But the movie itself isn't the real world, just a representation of it.
That's a helpful analogy. The sense data are like the frames of the movie representing the external objects, but the movie itself plays out in the theater of our minds.
Okay, I'm starting to get the gist of sense datum theory, but I'm already sensing some potential problems with it. I guess that's what we're here for, though, right? To wrestle with these ideas and see where they lead us.
Absolutely. And remember, we have several more theories to explore, each with its own unique approach to solving the problem of perception.
All right, bring on the next contender. What's this adverbialism all about?
Well, adverbialism takes a different tack altogether. Instead of positing these intermediary sense data, it suggests that perceiving is a way of being modified by our experiences.
Being modified. That sounds a bit abstract. Can you give me a concrete example of what that means?
Imagine your awareness is like a blank canvas. When you see a white wall, your experience of whiteness isn't about perceiving some separate thing called a sense datum. Instead, it's about your awareness being modified in a particular way. We could say you're seeing whitely.
So it's not that there's a little white image in my mind, but rather that the act of perceiving itself is somehow colored by the experience of white. Like my consciousness is taking on the quality of whiteness.
That's a great way to put it. And this applies to all our senses. You're not hearing a loud sound, you're hearing loudly. You're not feeling a rough texture, you're feeling roughly. It's about the way the experience modifies our awareness, rather than introducing these intermediary mental objects.
That's a pretty radical departure from sense datum theory. But how does this approach address the problem of perception? If I'm just seeing whitely during a hallucination, doesn't that still mean my experience isn't reflecting reality?
You're right to point that out. Adverbialism still has to grapple with the fact that experiences can be misleading. But instead of appealing to intermediaries like sense data, it tries to explain the character of experience through these modifications of our awareness. It's a subtle but significant difference.
I'm starting to see the nuances between these different theories, but my head is definitely spinning a bit. It's fascinating how many different ways philosophers have come up with to explain something as seemingly basic as seeing.
And we're not done yet. Let's move on to intentionalism, which has gained quite a bit of traction in contemporary philosophy. This theory argues that perceptual experiences are fundamentally about mental representation. In other words, our minds are creating models of the world.
So instead of directly perceiving objects or having our awareness modified, we're constructing these internal mental maps, kind of like our own personal virtual reality simulations.
Exactly. And these maps or models are what philosophers call intentional content. They're about something, they represent objects and their properties.
But if it all boils down to these mental representations, how is that any different from simply thinking about something? I can think about a snow-covered churchyard without actually seeing one, right?
That's a key question that intentionalists have to address. How do we distinguish between simply thinking about something and actually perceiving it, since both seem to involve mental representation?
Yeah, thinking about a tropical beach doesn't give me a tan or make me feel the sand between my toes. So what's the difference?
Well, some intentionalists argue that perceptual experiences have a unique kind of intentionality, one that's deeply connected to our senses and our bodily presence in the world.
So it's not just about the content of the mental representation, but also about how it's grounded in our physical embodiment in the data coming in from our senses.
Exactly. Perceptual representations are shaped by the information flowing in from our eyes, ears, and other senses. They're not just abstract thoughts floating around in our heads, but are anchored in our bodily engagement with the environment.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm guessing we still have to deal with those pesky illusions and hallucinations, right? If I hallucinate a snow-covered churchyard, I'm still representing it in my mind, even though it's not actually there.
Absolutely. Intentionalism has to find a way to account for those cases where our mental representations don't accurately reflect reality. One way to do this is by distinguishing between veridical perceptions, which accurately depict the world, and non-veridical ones, like illusions and hallucinations.
So the intentional content might be the same in both cases, but what makes the difference is whether that content is actually caused by a real object in the world.
Many intentionalists would say yes. They often draw on a causal theory of perception, arguing that veridical perceptions are those that are appropriately caused by the objects they represent. So seeing a real snow-covered churchyard involves a mental representation that's caused by light bouncing off the snow, the trees, and so on, but a hallucination lacks that causal connection to the real world.
So it's like saying a true perception is a mental representation that's been validated by reality, like having a stamp of authenticity from the object itself.
That's a good analogy. It's as if reality provides the blueprint for the mental model, ensuring its accuracy.
Intentionalism is definitely an interesting way to think about perception. But we have one more theory to tackle right equally. This naive realist disjunctivism sounds like it could be a real curveball.
It is. And it's particularly intriguing for a philosopher like yourself. Naive realist disjunctivism tries to hold on to the core intuition of direct realism that we genuinely perceive objects as they are, while also acknowledging the challenges posed by the problem of perception.
Now, hold on a minute. How is that even possible? We've already seen how illusions and hallucinations seem to completely undermine the idea of direct perception.
That's where the disjunctivism comes in. This view claims there's a fundamental difference between veridical perceptions and hallucinations. It's not just about causal connections, but about the very nature of the experience itself.
Are you saying that seeing a real object and hallucinating one are two completely different kinds of mental events, even if they feel the same?
Precisely. In a veridical perception, you're directly connected to the object experiencing it as it truly is. But a hallucination, despite feeling real, is a completely different animal. It's an experience generated internally without that direct link to an external object.
So it's like there are two separate tracks. The real perception track, where we're directly plugged into the world, and the hallucination track, where our mind is putting on its own show.
No.
But how can disjunctivists have their cake and eat it too? How can they maintain direct realism for real perceptions while acknowledging that our minds can also generate these convincing illusory experiences?
That's where things get really interesting, especially for someone who enjoys delving into the intricacies of philosophical arguments. Disjunctivists reject the so-called common kind assumption, which claims that veridical and hallucinatory experiences are fundamentally the same kind of thing. They argue that while these experiences might be phenomenally indistinguishable, meaning they feel the same to the subject, they have different underlying natures.
Okay, I can see how that might allow them to hold on to direct realism for veridical perceptions.
Yeah.
But how do they explain the fact that hallucinations can feel so real? If they're not the same kind of experience as seeing, how do they account for that vividness?
Well, one prominent disjunctivist, Martin, offers a negative epistemic account of hallucinations. He suggests that hallucinations don't have their own special content like sense data or representations. Instead, it's about what we can't know for sure within the experience itself.
So it's not that hallucinations have their own special kind of content, but rather that they lack a kind of epistemic grounding that vertical perceptions possess. But how does that help with the screening off problem? Doesn't that still mean that the common element, the indiscriminability, is doing all the heavy lifting?
This is where Martin makes a subtle but crucial distinction. He argues that the common element, the indiscriminability between veridical perceptions and hallucinations, isn't some independent thing that's doing the explaining. It's the veridical perception itself that's doing the heavy lifting. The indiscriminability is parasitic on the veridical perception.
Okay, I think I'm starting to follow you. It's like saying a counterfeit bill is defined by its resemblance to a genuine bill. The counterfeit doesn't have its own independent value. Its worth is entirely derived from the real thing.
Exactly. The common element, the indiscriminability, is only meaningful because it's based on the genuine article, the veridical perception, where we're directly connected to the object.
Wow, that's a pretty sophisticated move. It seems like disjunctivism is a lot more nuanced than I initially thought. But even if this negative epistemic account works, we've only been focusing on visual perception. What about our other senses?
That's a great point, and it's something that often gets overlooked in these discussions. The problem of perception isn't limited to vision. All our senses are susceptible to illusions and even hallucinations.
So I could have a phantom smell like freshly baked bread, even though
Wow.
there's no bread anywhere near me. And all these same challenges and theories would apply.
Absolutely. And that raises an important question. Do the theories we've discussed apply equally well to all our senses? Or do we need different theoretical frameworks to understand how we perceive the world through touch, smell, taste, and hearing?
Now that you mention it, sense datum theory, with its focus on mental representations, might work for vision but doesn't make sense for touch. Would we say we experience touch data instead of the actual texture of an object?
That's a question philosophers are still debating. Some argue that tactile experience is more immediate, more directly connected to the physical properties of objects than visual experience.
What about adverbialism? Would we say we're smelling sweetly instead of smelling a sweet scent?
That's a fascinating question. Adverbialism might face even more challenges when it comes to senses like smell and taste, where the qualities we experience seem so intimately bound up with the objects themselves.
And what about intentionalism? Could we say that all our sensory experiences are just different forms of mental representation? Does that mean we construct a separate virtual reality simulation for each sense?
That's an interesting way to think about it. Intentionalism might have an easier time here, arguing that all our senses provide information that's used to construct those internal models of the world. The difference lies in the type of information. Each sense delivers visual information for building a visual model, auditory information for an auditory model, and so on.
So it's like each sense contributes a different layer to our overall mental representation of the world.
Exactly. And those layers combine to create a rich and multisensory experience.
But what about naive, realist disjunctivism? How would it handle the fact that we can have hallucinations in any sensory modality?
Well, disjunctivists could argue that the same principle applies. There's a fundamental difference between veridical and hallucinatory experiences, regardless of the sense involved.
So whether it's a visual hallucination or an auditory one, the disjunctivist would say it's not a genuine perception, but a different kind of mental event.
Precisely. And the challenge for them, as with vision, would be to explain the phenomenal character of those hallucinatory experiences, how they can feel so real despite not being grounded in actual objects.
Wow, this deep dive has really opened my eyes, so to speak, to the complexities of perception. What seemed like such a straightforward process turns out to be a philosophical minefield. But it's also been incredibly stimulating, challenging me to think about the world in a whole new way.
It's been a pleasure unpacking these ideas with you. And I think the key takeaway here is that the problem of perception, while centered on our senses, ultimately touches on profound questions about the nature of reality knowledge and consciousness itself.
Absolutely. We've explored how different philosophical theories attempt to bridge the gap between our subjective experiences and the objective world. Each theory has its strengths and weaknesses, and the debate is far from settled. But that's what makes philosophy so fascinating. It pushes us to question, to explore, and to keep searching for a deeper understanding.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one to develop a new theory of perception that revolutionizes the field.
Hey, a philosopher can dream, right? But seriously, this deep dive has given me a lot to chew on. And for all of you listening, I hope it sparked your curiosity as well.
Remember, the world is full of sensory wonders just waiting to be explored and understood.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and until next time, happy perceiving.